In 1497, he hit upon a solution.
He closed the ports, and he declared that all Jews have to leave or they have to convert to Christianity. Now, since the ports were closed and the borders to Spain were closed, there was nowhere for the Jews to go. And there are records of priests going through the Jewish areas of Lisbon and elsewhere with huge barrels of holy water and wholesale sprinkling them with holy water and saying, "You're all Christians." In other words, he effectively converted the entire Jewish community at one blow and declared that they're all Christians.
The majority of the Jews in Portugal lived outwardly as Christians, but kept Judaism in secret. Unfortunately, however, the tentacles of the Inquisition were soon unleashed, and this brought about terrible persecution. In the ensuing years, thousands of families succeeded in escaping Portugal to begin life anew elsewhere. Few 15th century Jews could consider themselves unscarred by the horrors. Many Jews were first-hand victims, having run through the flames on their way out of Spain and Portugal. Others, including Rabbi Eliyahu Kapsali, experienced the horror secondhand. Rabbi Kapsali was born on the Mediterranean island of Crete, then known as the Kingdom of Candia, in 1483. His father, the chief rabbi of Candia, mobilized a relief network for the waves of Jewish refugees fleeing the Iberian Peninsula. The young Eliyahu was deeply affected by their tales of unspeakable horror. Rabbi Kapsali set his hand to the quill. He viewed the unexplainable evils as a backdrop to the greatest and most enduring salvation, that of the Messianic era.
So you find among Spanish and Portuguese Jews in Spain and Portugal, and certainly among those who were exiled, an intensification of a sense of the coming of the Messiah and a yearning for the coming of the Messiah because of the travails that they had undergone under the Inquisition, in the expulsion, and this whole sense that the world had turned upside down.
Rabbi Kapsali noted that Jews were now more concentrated and less spread out, and he viewed this as a preparatory phase for the ingathering of exiles. In fact, the majority of Spanish and Portuguese refugees had resettled in the Ottoman Empire, which governed the land of Israel, sparking an unprecedented wave of return to the Jewish homeland. For these reasons, many Jews believed that all the arrows were pointing to the imminent redemption of the Jewish people. Perhaps the catastrophes of Spain and Portugal were the prophetic sufferings that were said to precede the Messianic age. But is the Messianic redemption a fate to wait for with folded arms? Or does it require determined action at an opportune time? The Jews of the 16th century were divided over this dilemma. One rabbi was particularly convinced that Jews had to seize the opportunity. Rabbi Shlomo Mocho was born in Portugal in the year 1500. His family was forcibly converted to Christianity, and as a child, he was neither circumcised nor educated in Judaism.
And he was a very talented individual who ended up serving in a very senior capacity in the service of Manuel I, the King of Portugal, who actually brought about the forced conversion of the Jews of Portugal.
Despite having a highly accomplished position at the royal court, Shlomo Mocho was eventually inspired to discover Judaism. He fled to Italy, where he fully re-embraced the religion of his ancestors, a capital offense in Christian lands in those days. He became a prominent rabbi and teacher of Kabbalah, but his brilliance and charisma also curried favor with Italy's aristocrats and rulers. In 1532, Rabbi Shlomo traveled to Germany to meet the Emperor, Charles V, on a most ambitious mission. He hoped to convince Charles to supply military arms to the Jews of his empire and enable them to wage war against the Ottoman Turks, who then ruled the Holy Land. Charles stood to gain from such an endeavor, since this would greatly weaken his most worrisome foe.
This is the era in which the Ottoman Turks are developing their empire. The Ottoman Turks ultimately will almost conquer Europe. So the Ottomans were a very serious threat, and Christendom was very concerned about them.
In fact, Charles had only recently received information that the Ottoman army was readying for war against him. Shlomo Mocho thought that Charles would welcome a Jewish alliance against the Turks. News of Mocho's intentions reached the ears of the German Jewish community before Mocho's arrival. One famous rabbi, the legendary Yosul Rosheim, paid close attention.
He was best known for intervening on behalf of Jews throughout Christian Europe, especially in the areas of the empire. So whenever there was a blood libel or whenever there were agitations against Jews, whenever Jews were in danger, he would swoop in and he would try to help them.
Yosul of Rosheim saw danger in Shlomo Mocho's plan to ask Charles V to arm the Jews of his empire.
Charles V, in a sense, was even more religious and more fanatic than the Pope. That's not a big surprise. His mother was a woman named Juana la Loca, Joanne the Mad, who was the daughter of none other than our friends Ferdinand and Isabella. He was like his grandparents on steroids. So all he could see when he met Shlomo Mocho was a renegade Jew.
Rabbi Yosul tried to dissuade Mocho, but the latter was determined to press forward nonetheless. When he came before the emperor, Rabbi Shlomo was given the same choice his family had faced before he was born. And now, in the moment of truth, he chose the Jewish faith once again. Although his bold plan died with him, its underlying messianic motivation did not. The disagreement between Rabbi Mocho and Rabbi Yosul of Rosheim highlighted the great debate of that era. Many Jews viewed the catastrophes of Spain and Portugal as the prophetic sufferings that were thought to precede the Messianic age. The question was, how active a messianic role must the Jewish people take when they sense that the time is ripe for redemption? For the likes of Rabbi Yosul of Rosheim, bettering one's personal service of God through study, prayer, and good deeds was all that was required. But for the likes of Rabbi Mocho, this was allowing the opportunity for the Jewish redemption to slip away. God had signaled to the Jews through world events that if they were to rise up and make their way home, he would crown their efforts with messianic success. This debate continued to ferment in rabbinic circles. Then, in 1538, just 5 years after Rabbi Mocho's martyrdom, the contention erupted furiously in the controversy over rabbinic ordination.
They don't hear me. All right, ladies and gents, welcome back to today's shiur. The video was a little bit longer than I anticipated. The video was describing a little bit about the history of Spanish-Portuguese Jewry and the era of the expulsion. But the reason I wanted to put that on is because it leads up to the topic of today's discussion. You see, Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, was very much under the wraps for a long time. And when did it become more popular and promulgated to the masses? That was during the era of Rabbi Isaac Luria, who was known as the Arizal. So this video is just to give you a little bit of a backdrop and to explain a little bit about that. So if we look at the current slide, we see here, we know that the basic core of Judaism we have is the Torah, the written law. Unlike Gentiles who look at it as Bible, which is bibliography, which means history, that's his story or her story. You know why Moshe had to make the coffee? Because he brewed. But we don't see it as his story. We have to look at Torah as our story, which you've heard many times from me. In fact, what is the meaning of the word Torah? It means instruction, not Bible, not history. So it's true the nations of the world call Bible. They see it as giving us the history of mankind, etc., etc. But the Jewish perspective is that Torah is not just his story, it's our story. And that's why it's an instruction manual, the blueprint for all of existence and creation. And interestingly, today, the 18th of Elul, marks, we're going to discuss in a moment the significance of why we're talking about Kabbalah today, but it marks it's 12 days before Rosh Hashanah from today, okay? Actually from tomorrow, but today is also appropriate because today's the 17th of Elul. But why today? I should really give you this class tomorrow because tomorrow's the 18th. First of all, this way you come better prepared into Chai Elul because it's a significant date, which I will tell you in a moment why. But more than that, this past year was 13 months on the Jewish calendar, right? It was a leap year. We had double Adar, double joy. Why is Adar chosen as the month to double, not Elul or another month? Well, exactly, because Adar is a month of joy. So if there's any month we want to duplicate, do it twice, should certainly be the month of joy, the month that contains Purim. Also, we know long kashrut. The long kashrut is if something non-kosher falls into something kosher, even though to begin with you should never do such things. Or let's say even two kosher things that mix together that shouldn't be mixed, such as milk and meat. Did I ever tell you the story about a congregant, somebody I know? I'm not going to give away too much information. And then somebody watches this video one day and says, "Oh, you told the story about me." Okay, but you don't know who they are, so just in case you do watch the video one day, nobody knows it's you. All right. So the story it was two people I know that were getting, both Jewish families, thank God, because today that's not a given that a Jewish kid is going to marry somebody Jewish. In fact, yesterday a man was telling me his daughter's dating a nice Gentile. And I said, well, is he considering to convert to Judaism? He says to me, yeah, who cares? His kids will be Jewish anyhow because his daughter's Jewish. It's very sad for me to hear that because people have lost that whole sensitivity, that the father doesn't even care that his daughter's marrying out of faith. In this case, thank God they were both Jewish, good people, except one family was a little bit more religiously involved than the other. I would venture to say that one family is fairly frum, at least the parents were frum, and the other family was fairly distant. I hate to use the word distant because who's to decide who's distant from God? The Rebbe didn't like the term kiruv rechokim, which is a conventional term used about outreach. The Rebbe didn't like that term because he said, how do we know who's close or distant from God? That's not for us to determine. So I'm using the wrong word. In fact, there's a story that happened around this time of the year in the 1980s, and it's recorded on video. There's a major philanthropist in New York. Well, I'm sure he lives in many places, named George Rohr. Gives millions of dollars to charity and particularly to Chabad institutions. And George Rohr was very happy to come to the Rebbe. The Rebbe used to have, it started in the 1980s, a line, and when there were just so many people who wanted to see him, and he just didn't have enough time in a day to see everybody. So every Sunday, the Rebbe would stand outside his office and give out dollar bills and blessings. And every person filing by had a few seconds with him. Sometimes if you had something important to discuss with him, maybe you had, a couple of minutes. And in this instance, George Rohr, major philanthropist, comes by and he tells the Rebbe that he should be very proud of him because he organized a minyan at his shul. He attends the KJ, Kehilat Jeshurun Synagogue in the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Many prestigious people go to that shul, including Donald Trump's daughter Ivanka and his son-in-law Jared Kushner. And so, I don't think they were going then. Maybe the Kushners were. I don't think the Trumps were. But either way, he was very proud, Mr. Rohr, of his minyan. And he said to the Rebbe, I organized the minyan for hundreds of Jews who have no background. And the Rebbe grew very serious, and he was wondering what he said wrong. And the Rebbe responded and said, you go tell them that they have a very illustrious background. They are descendants of Abraham and Sarah and Yitzchak and Rivka and Yaakov and Rachel and Leah. They have a very prestigious background. Yeah.
No, I wanted to suggest a word, then I thought it might not be good.
What was it?
Tradition.
Traditional. Yeah. Whatever term you might want to use for it. The point is, I'm just telling a story about two families, not to make it too. Anyways, it was just two families here to Gesund. And the Frum family obviously would only eat at the other family if they were going to be serve kosher food. This wasn't a worry for the wedding because the wedding was catered by a Bethton supervised caterer. It's not a worry for going out to restaurants. But the Mechutanim wanted to host the religious, how do you say Mechutanim, in-laws, for a dinner in their home. So they arranged for somebody to come, Kobe Cohen, kosher the kitchen, blowtorch the whole thing, and made sure everything was strictly kosher, and gave them the rules. If you're serving meat, it has to be, with a Western supervision, and milk, same thing. And they brought them over to the house. And the missus was so proud to bring out of the oven. She said everything was bought at Moishi's butchery. And she made this delicious lasagna. And it was a meat lasagna, but it also had kosher meat from Moishi's, and it had kosher cheese from Moishi's, all mixed together. And this was innocent. And I know these people, and they joke about it, ever since. It's a joke. They sat at my Shabbos table some time ago, and we all joked about, remember that time of the... Okay, but obviously, the core of Jewish law is in here. You have the written Torah, which is what people call the Bible, the 24 books of Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Kesuvim, right? And then you have the oral Torah, which is the Masoret, the word you just suggested, tradition, which includes the Midrash and the Mishnah and the Talmud and all the other works of Jewish literature that create the core of Jewish law, of halacha. And if I'm throwing, yesterday we talked all about the royal family, and I told you 3 incredible stories about them. I want to say the royal family actually is you. Each one of us are the royal family. The Torah gives us an instruction. The Torah, God says, you be for me a kingdom of priests, a holy nation. We just read in the parsha last week, Banim atem Hashem, you are children unto God. If you are children unto God, you are certainly royalty. And as much as everyone's God's creation, we have to know what it means to be the chosen people. Some people are embarrassed. What does it mean to be the chosen people? Is this some kind of Jewish supremacy, conspiracy? No. You have to know what you're chosen for. Everyone's chosen by God. That's why they exist. They're indispensable to God's plan. You were chosen to follow the Torah. That's what you're chosen for. So follow the Torah. Now, you say, well, why do I have to be different? It's so embarrassing to be different than others. Well, I look up to, so many people admired Queen Elizabeth for how distinct and special and regal she was. Now let's just think for a moment. Queen Elizabeth followed very strict protocol in the way she behaved, in the way she dressed so elegantly, in the way she spoke, every one of her mannerisms. Everything, all of her conduct was done in a specific way because she's royalty. And now, King Charles, going to have to get used to that one. King Charles III, he's going to have to get used to some mannerisms too. Okay. Well, nothing wrong with him being a little human. Well, he did see his mom, but over the years, he bent some of the rules. One thing we certainly know today is that, the monarchy is not it's respected because I think she gave it the respect. I don't think monarchies today are revered the way they once were. Once upon a time it was about subjugation, and there was a dread and a fear. You were afraid of the sovereignty. It was a tyranny. No? Today that's not the case because people like Queen Elizabeth and her father, King George, and hopefully King Charles will maintain that. And will give it a certain dignity and respect that it can be looked up to. Because otherwise that will be lost too.
As you're saying, and it's true,
Yeah.
monarchy was undesirable in the old days.
Certainly there were cruel
Why did
tyrants.
the Jews crave and demand from Hashem a king?
Okay, that's a separate story that goes all the way back to the time of the prophet Shmuel. The reason the Jews craved and asked for a king, simply put, in fact, Shmuel admonished them. He said, because you just want to be like everybody else. But in the Torah it says you should want a king because the king should be the role model who will inspire the people, who will set the right example to them on how to live in the appropriate way to worship God. I will tell you a personal story. My great-grandfather, who was known as Reb David Haraducker, his surname was Kivim, but he came from the city of Haraduk, so they called him Haraducker. He actually cried and mourned when the Tsar Nicholas was assassinated. Now, why would he cry for a tyrant like Nicholas was no friend of the Jews. And many pogroms happened during this time because of his behaviors and because of, all the Tsars were not the best friends of the Jews. So why would my great-grandfather, who was a rabbi, why would he cry when Nicholas was murdered? Worried about the next guy. You never know who's worse, right? And it's true because the communists, the Bolsheviks, Lenin and Stalin were no better. But he also he mourned the fact, he said, that in order in life, in order to understand an idea, you have to some degree experience it. Without experiencing it, you don't know what it is. I could tell you about steak, how amazing it tastes. I mean, I personally don't like steak, so don't try that one on me. But whatever it might be, you want something, you won't know and you won't understand it until you experience it yourself. Any experience. Now, the idea of understanding it, we're coming to Yom Tov now, we're going to say, Avinu Malkeinu, right? Our Father, our King. But what is the concept of a king? It's so hard for people to relate. What's the idea of a king? So Hasidus tells us the concept of the king we could best understand because we've had kings. And hopefully when there were good kings who treated us favorably, decently, we're not asking for better treatment than anybody else, just treat us, as equals. In that sense, we had a complicated relationship with the monarchs. There was a Jewish monarchy up until maybe 2,000 years ago. But that monarchy was terminated with the destruction of the temple, even prior to that. So today, it's hard for us to imagine and to relate to the concept of a king, of a sovereignty. And the only way we can relate to it, I think the idea of a queen, who she gave us some aspect. You think about the crown jewels. Anyone been to London and tried to see the crown jewels? What is it called, the place where this? I never got to go. I waited in that line forever. Tower of London. I bought tickets in 1998. I went there. I waited on the queue forever, and then I left because it just took forever to go in. But what's the value of those crown jewels? How much are they worth? You can't give it up. It's priceless. Good. You see how many metaphors are present in this. You see, you're priceless. If I tell you they're worth 10 billion, well, 10 billion is a certain value, right? It's less than 11 billion. It's more than 9 billion. But when I tell you they're priceless, that's what we mean when we say that you're indispensable to God. And in that sense, you're priceless. And that's what I say, each one of us are royals. And not to feel bad in the sense that, you have rules and regulations. The Torah, it's so restrictive. Don't see it that way. When you see Judaism as restrictive, right, people complain. Some people say, oy vey, Shabbos, there's so many rules. I can't do this and I can't do that. What if you see Shabbos otherwise? What if you see Shabbos as a day that you can relax and you're not any longer, sorry about that, guys, and you're no longer in any way forced and coerced to be, to be a prison to your cell phone. That's why it's called a cell phone, because where we become prisoners. So think about Shabbos and kosher. If you have a good appetite, then you think about kosher as a good way to restrict, to control it. And all the rules of Judaism, they could be seen as restrictive, or they could be seen as beneficial, just like the monarchy has rules, but those rules elevate them, right? They don't see it as, do you think the monarchy sees their rules as, oh gosh, we're so different than the rest of society? Maybe they do. Maybe that's why there are some who break away from it. And maybe that's why we have Jewish people also sometimes say, let me try other things out. But ultimately, the monarchy wants to come back to, you want to see, you realize you're privileged, and we should see ourselves as the Jewish people also as privileged as such. And so, the first points we're making here on today's discussion is about the basic tradition. Oh, thank you for that. Let's see. Okay, thank you.
I'm not sure if I'll be able to really catch stuff.
Thank you so much. Never a dull moment. It's good. Baruch Hashem. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. True. That's what it's about. So now, while we do this outline, let's get into the mystical element, because that's what's related to the holiday we're celebrating tonight. And with that, I would like to invite you all to come join us this evening. We're going to have a very special function, musical event, live music, in person. There will be 4 keynote speakers, and there will be refreshments at the Capitol Hotel in Santon. It's a 1-hour event. Come for an extra dosage of inspiration. Say yes to a better year is the theme that we're presenting tonight. It's not going to be on Zoom. Zoom is the COVID era. We're out of COVID. Mike's grandkids were able to come from Australia, which had the most restrictive COVID rules, right? In the whole world. But here you are. So COVID, please God, it's over. If you want, you can wear your mask, but come join us tonight at the Capitol Hotel. I think you'll enjoy tonight's event, and it'll be worthwhile to come. Capitol Hotel's on Catherine Corner, Pretoria, and Santon. And everybody's welcome to join us there for that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what is unique about this day. What's unique about this day? Well, on this day, in 1698, was the birth of the Baal Shem Tov. But in order to understand his teachings and his inspiration, that's why I presented the video before. Because that video gave you the background of how Kabbalah came out of its shell, so to say. Because it was around. But as we saw in the text, that it was something that was only studied by far and few in between. It only started to become promulgated in the times of Rabbi Isaac Luria, known as the Arizal. And he said that this mysticism no longer has to be kept secret, it no longer has to be limited to those specific virtuous individuals who are worthy of studying it. And instead, he sees the opportunity now to present its teaching, to teach them to the masses, which is what happened. And this is what we're going to talk about today, how it went from the times of the Arizal into the era of the Baal Shem Tov. Why is our text getting stuck? I'm not going to read the text now. This text basically tells us, Maimonides, about quoting from the Talmud, why Kabbalah was not taught to the masses, because it's deep, it's esoteric, it's mystical, and you really had to have a good understanding of it, and that's why it wasn't something that was taught by everyone. So we're going to move on from this text onto our next one. I apologize, for some reason today the system is running a little slow, so you just have to bear with me. This is more relevant to the people online because I see how slow it is on the other side. Now the Zohar, which I said is based on the teachings of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Here you could see a picture of the cover. Now I think this one, the first print is in Mantova, Italy. You could probably find this today. Where? In London at Oxford University in their library archives. They actually have a lot of Jewish texts, and that's where this can be found. So if you're interested in that, I spent many a Shabbos at Oxford University about 21 years ago. I spent a year studying in London 22 years ago. Gee, time flies. I was a little kid then. I'm still a little kid. Can't believe it. But 22 years ago, I was in London for the year. I used to love going to Buckingham Palace and looking at all those statues outside there. Those statues even moved sometimes, you know. I loved watching the changing of the guard. I would always come for the change. It was just something about it. It was fun. It was nice to watch that royalty. So the Zohar, which as we said is authored by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, or compiled based on his teachings. And again, this was something that wasn't taught to the masses. It wasn't something that was studied, that was learned by the public. And the reason is because of all the deep codes inside it. It wasn't something that people could understand and relate to. It was written originally in Aramaic, and you really had to decipher the codes within it and understand what it meant. So this wasn't something the masses were familiar with until came along a great sage who survived, not him, his parents survived the Spanish Inquisition. They were Spanish Jews. And we know the history, or if you watched the video before, you saw part of it, of the edict, as you can see right here. I don't know what language it's written in. I guess in old ancient Spanish, maybe. The expulsion signed by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. A good example of a king and queen. Well, actually, he was a nice king for some time. In fact, he had Jewish advisors, but they couldn't win over the cruel, heartless advice of his wife, Isabella, who actually came up with the idea of expelling the Jews. She was poisoned by her advisors, and we know what happened in 1492, when the Jews were ultimately expelled first from Spain, and then a few years later from Portugal, 5 years later from Portugal as well. I'm going to put up the history of it in short. You have 1391 anti-Jewish riots across Spain. Many Jews murdered or forcibly converted. Then you have in 1478, the Inquisition formally begins. When we talked yesterday about 1938 Germany, I think by then it was quite clear, but the story I told you about Tuvia Weiss, his parents weren't quite certain what's going to be. Many people stayed behind, and this repeats itself from time to time. The same idea, the same concept. Who says it's going to be so bad until it's too bad? And that's what happened there to many people who got stuck behind in Spain or Portugal. They were either murdered, or forcibly converted to Christianity. That's what wound up happening. So this is the timeline in short. I'm obviously missing lots of things. I'm just putting key events onto the screen so you get an idea of the key dates of what happened and when they happened. And this is when 1497, pardon? You can watch the video after. I'll slow down on some other things. I'm sorry. Because I want to focus on certain particular things. Apologies about that. Here we have the Arizal. The Arizal's parents, by the way, all that was an introduction. Here's where I'll slow it down, okay? That was all an introduction to the point I wanted to talk about. So those were just, by the way stuff. Now is the core of where I'm getting to. The Arizal. The Arizal was born in 1534 and passed away in 1572. He did not live a long life, as you can tell. He's, just look at his lifespan. He was born in Tzfat. His parents were refugees who escaped from the Spanish Inquisition. And here in the picture, you can see his burial place in Tzfat, which is in northern Israel. I'm not sure the reason why everything is in blue there. All the graves are in blue. His synagogue is painted in blue. There must be some mystical reason, maybe you know.
Everything in Israel is blue. The blue doors, the blue pavements, everything's that blue.
Maybe the concept of looking up to the sky, the beautiful, reminder of Hashem, there must be some mystical reasons. Even Clive is all dressed in blue there.
I have no idea. That snail that they caught to get the blue dye.
The Tchelas, yes. The tzitzis was also Tchelas. So at that point, when the Jews were expelled from Spain, one of the countries that opened its borders to Jewish refugees from the Iberian Peninsula, from Spain and Portugal, was the Ottoman Empire ruled by the Turks. We'll get back to the Turks just now when we talk about Shabtai Tzvi, because he was in the Turkish Empire and proclaimed himself to be Mashiach. That's a separate story, not really, it's just parenthetical. But the land of Israel was part of the Ottoman Empire, because while Israel was conquered by the Romans were also, overthrown, and then came the Byzantines, and then came the Crusaders, and I don't know, all the others in between. I mean, Islam, right? The Muslims built their shrine on the Temple Mount. All the different nations that took over and conquered Israel, the Ottoman Empire actually ruled Israel for probably the longest period until the British took over as caretakers during the First World War. So the Ottoman Empire controlled Israel for quite a long time, and they saw the value of having Jewish people in their empire, and they allowed Jews to return to Israel, and so Jews found a safe haven in Turkish-ruled countries, and particularly returning to their homeland, to Israel. So here's where you have the Jewish communities in Israel reviving. There was always an unbroken Jewish presence in Israel, even from the time of the temple's destruction all the way until today. But at times it was very far and few in between. It was difficult there. The land was undeveloped. There were many challenges of living in Israel. I even mentioned to you yesterday, my own grandmother, my mother's family, how they came to Israel as chalutzim, as pioneers in the 1920s and 30s, and it was difficult then. It was difficult. They weren't used to the heat. There was malaria, mosquitoes. They had to work the land. It just wasn't what they were used to, and many people couldn't settle there. It certainly was hard. There's no doubt about it. By the time my father came in 1947, in the Exodus ship, it was a lot more developed by then, but it was also hard. I tell you, my father left Israel in the early 50s and never went back. That's how difficult it was. That's how difficult it was. He allowed us to go to Israel. He didn't allow us to go to Russia, where he came from originally, but I still went. Oh, I'm in trouble. He didn't want me to go to Russia. I said, Tati, I love you, and I'm sorry that you had a bad experience there. I want to see firsthand what your experience was, and I went. He didn't like it. Pardon? Yes, but I went over 20 years ago. 23 years ago I went there. It was quite a nice experience. For sure, he experienced horrors there. Yeah, absolutely. But what happened was, after the Spanish Inquisition, with so many Jewish refugees coming to the land of Israel, slowly Jewish life began. I'll put the previous slide back on in case you want to catch up with it. Just so if you wanted to catch up on those notes, because I'll focus on these points for a few minutes. So slowly you had Jewish life that returned and started to thrive. And many of the refugees in Tzfat were actually great Torah scholars, venerable sages who revived Judaism in the Holy Land. And these people transformed the city of Tzfat into a bastion of Torah scholarship, giving it like a unique branding, like you saw the blue in the picture, because they were very mystical. And these people spent a lot of time on the mystical aspects of Judaism. And among the sages there was Rabbi Moshe Cordovera. He held court there. He was known as the Ramak. There was, I'm trying to remember the names of some of the others. It's skipping my head. Of course, the Arizal and his successor, Rabbi Chaim Vital, Rabbi Shlomo, I'm forgetting the names, but many other great mystical sages. Many of them were either themselves survivors or children of survivors of the Spanish Inquisition. Like you saw a revival of Torah in a sense after the Holocaust, a tremendous revival of Torah. I mean, I don't know if before the Holocaust the Torah way of life was as prolific as whatever the correct word for this would be, as it was after. You look at Israel today, and you look at the USA, and even South Africa. Let's look at South Africa as an example, okay? Certainly Israel, because Israel was a very small Jewish presence in Israel before the Holocaust. So you could see how in Israel, Torah just grew and flourished there. And in America, so many bastions, cities that flourish with Torah. But even here in South Africa, it flourished after the Holocaust.
No.
No?
No.
You would say before the Holocaust that Judaism
What
here was...
about the advent of communism in Russia and the Lithuanian Jews?
I still don't think that at that time, yes, it existed. But the point I'm making is that there was a certain revival and resurrection of Judaism after the Spanish Inquisition that we saw certainly in Israel, and that's the point I'm making, not to get sidetracked. And here you had these great sages, and there was a surprising shift that took place in their approach to the teachings of the Torah's mystical side. Because prior to the Arizal, who, as you saw, lived in 1534 to 1572, mysticism was, a few people studied it. A few people didn't really expound much on it. And all of a sudden, Kabbalah had this revival. Before, it was only known to a select few. It was now studied openly. It was something that changed. It became part of the Jewish consciousness. That was what the Arizal contributed in a tremendous sense. And it wasn't just the teachings of mysticism, it was a whole way of life. So around the year 1570 is when the Arizal started teaching this. He was a young man. And he began teaching Kabbalah in his unique style. He had a group of gifted students who followed in his way, because I don't think he wrote any works himself. Rather, the books that are attributed to the Arizal were recorded by his students. He created this Kabbalistic revolution, call it. And he believed that the time had come to promote the teachings of the Torah's innermost secrets, that these should become known to the masses. He believed that a deeper mystical understanding of Judaism, and not just of Judaism, of reality, was precisely what was needed to infuse the Jewish people with strength, with resilience in the face of all the persecution, the suffering, the hardships, the struggles, and the challenges that they had faced during that time. And he said, even if it meant that some of these Kabbalistic teachings might be misunderstood, that maybe a Madonna is going to come along and put on a red string and create some pop culture out of Kabbalah, he said, okay, that's a small price to pay in order to give the Jewish people an inner perspective of life as is taught by the mysticism, by Kabbalah, to give us a deep sense of moral fortitude. And that's why the Arizal, he really felt that it wasn't just about the Jewish community, because what happens with us is a reflection of what's going on around the world. He saw the winds of change throughout the world going on at the time. And he believed that circumstances that perhaps previously was a reason not to teach it had changed. And therefore, the concepts that maybe previously were too abstract for people to understand, he felt that now was a good time. And maybe during that time is when science started to become also more popular. So it sort of was commensurate. It was like around the same time that these things were happening. And you'll see that later on. When does Hasidism flourish? During the Industrial Revolution, right? So everything has a correlation. Where the Jewish changes are happening, there's also global changes that are happening simultaneously. So the Arizal, how old would he be by the time he passed away? Let's just look at his grave. So he was 38, right? 38 years old. And he never managed to actually publish his own works, like I said. But his students, they committed his wisdom into writing, and they kept the revolution going, and they brought Kabbalah to the center stage of Judaism. Now it was being studied by so many, and people were finding it fascinating, and the idea is not just to have an abstract, cognitive, intellectual, academic concept that's deep, but to make it a way of life, right? Academically it was very popular for people to delve into it. But the Arizal was showing people that it's a way of life as well. And therefore, they learned to flavor their mastery of Judaism, whether it was halacha or other aspects of Jewish insight with perspectives that were rooted in deep understanding of Jewish theology through the lens of Kabbalah, which I'm going to put it on the screen in a second to show you what it means through the lens of Kabbalah, what was different about it. But it was certainly a fresh perspective. And like I said, it wasn't just intellectual, but it was also about their behaviors. Jewish practice came under the influence of Kabbalistic revival. And many of the mystically inspired customs of the Arizal became universally known. And I mean, the Siddur we daven from in Chabad is the Nusach of the Arizal. Many of the universal Jewish prayers, he was a Sephardi, by the way, a Sephardic Jew, because he came from Spain. But both the Ashkenaz European Jewry adopted his teachings. Like if you take, for example, Lecha Dodi. Who authored Lecha Dodi? Rabbi Shlomo Alkabetz. Exactly. That's the name I was looking for before. So he was one of those sages at that time. And it's filled with mystical ideas, and that became accepted and adopted by all world Jewry. Yes?
Just to give clarity in my mind
Yeah.
about who did what. The Arizal's teaching of Kabbalah, was it limited to the yeshivas, or was it accessible to Israel?
It was accessible to all at that stage. Probably it didn't yet, the Baal Shem Tov really took it to the next level. But he already opened it up. I think he already opened the channels, the Arizal. But the Baal Shem Tov, whose birthday is tonight, 1698, was his birth. So the Baal Shem Tov is the one who really took it to the next level. But the Baal Shem Tov couldn't have done that if not for the developmental, the groundbreaking work of the Arizal before him, pretty much 120 years before him.
Because I know there's great resistance to teaching of Kabbalah in the yeshivas of the time.
Well, not exactly. I think that's a little bit confusing because, for example, the Baal Shem Tov's movement was known as Hasidim, and the opposition to him was called the Misnagdim. Ironically, the Hasidim were the new group, the Misnagdim were the opponents to it, and they're headed by one of the great rabbis who led this opposition against the Hasidim was, for example, the Vilna Gaon. The Vilna Gaon was a great scholar, Rabbi Eliyahu Vilna. Many people think he was against the teaching of mysticism. That's not the case because he himself studied Kabbalah. So I think it had to do with certain interpretations and behaviors which he opposed. But as you can see by now, Hasidism really changed the way of Jewish life, but certainly was opposed at first. Okay, so let's look here. I'm putting up another map of that era. I will try to put the whole map on so you could just go through it and see. End of the 15th century said is the arrival of Sephardic Jews to the land of Israel. 1570, we have the Arizal, who passed away in 1572, and he begins teaching the Lurianic school of Kabbalah. Just a quick recap here. And finally, we have 16th century, where all of these teachings become spread, dispersed everywhere. It's inspiring Jews everywhere to study the teachings of mysticism. Now, that takes us into our next personality, the birthday boy, or the first birthday boy that we're celebrating tonight. First one is the Baal Shem Tov. The second one is the Alter Rebbe, who was born in 1745, same date. And probably a good way for us to understand what the Sephardic Jews suffered in the 15th century in Spain and Portugal. The Ashkenazi Jews were experiencing somewhat of a revival at that time because already beginning in the 14th century, there was a whole mass exodus of Jews who were moving towards Central Europe. And they were moving to places like Poland and its vicinities. In fact, that's where my mother's family came from, Poland. They were called Galicianos. And they had a motto. They said that Poland, which is, I guess, the Polish name for the country, in Hebrew spells Polim. Here we could finally relax. After all the persecution they experienced from the Crusaders in Germany and France, and from the Inquisition in Spain and Portugal, and persecution in so many other places, Poland was a safe haven, or so they thought. And it was. Jews found peace and economic stability. If you read I was reading a book that describes what the Jewish community in Poland was. If you think about our community with institutions such as the Chevra Kadisha, I read that Polish Jewry, if a Jew wanted, the community was so wealthy, you didn't have to go to work. If you wanted to study Torah, I guess similar to the kollel system that exists today in many communities, you were able to sit and study because the community was so wealthy and affluent that the wealthy were happy to support the poor, and the poor really didn't exist. There was no poverty at that stage because basically, like the Torah describes, Yisachar and Zavulun, those who worked supported those who didn't, and it was an incredible setup of a community. By the way, we also, I have to tell you, I was at a conference the other day where I heard somebody describing, not knowing that I'm involved with Hatzalah, but just saying, as an example, you guys have Hatzalah in Melbourne? Okay, Hatzalah, I don't know how city ambulances, chances are in Melbourne, they're effective and quick city ambulance, so I'm not sure, that Hatzalah is as essential. But in Johannesburg, the city ambulance doesn't work so efficiently. And this man was talking, he said, not only city, he was saying how Hatzalah is just superior to any ambulance service. And he was talking about how in South Africa, there aren't enough defibrillators. Yet, every single school and shul, every Jewish institution has an AED, an automated electronic defibrillator right here in this room. If God forbid somebody collapses, immediately we could come to their rescue. I was at a dentist the other day, he told me he was flying Emirates to Croatia. And he was describing a guy on the plane with him. He says he paid for an upgrade to sit in business for him and his wife. And, they needed this break. And he describes that he describes this guy sitting on the plane. This guy's got 3 cell phones, and the whole flight from Dubai to Croatia, the guy's on the phone. He says it was quite annoying, but that's what it was. He says they get off the plane, and a few meters off the, what do you call that galley that you walk through? The guy collapses. So he's a doctor. He asks, can you bring me the AED? They said, no, we can't take the defibrillator off the plane. You're in Croatia now. The Croatians have to provide it. They didn't allow him to take it off the plane. He tried to perform CPR for some time. He was, doing CPR on this fellow until eventually it took 11 minutes, he said, till they got the AED. And it took over an hour for an ambulance crew to come. So very sad, and the man did not make it, unfortunately. A young guy, about 40 years old, an Egyptian fellow. A couple of years ago, I got a Hatzalah call one Saturday night to the Michelangelo Hotel. So considering that I live about a block away from the Michelangelo, I was the first on scene. They took me into a room where there was a pilot from Egyptian Airways who ate some fish, caused them food poisoning. And who came to respond? It was all rabbis. It was myself and two other rabbis who are in Hatzalah. All three of us were the ones treating him. So he remarked afterwards, he said, it's incredible. He's never been to Israel. He said, I never had anything to do with the Jewish people, but he was very grateful to us. And I'm grateful, thank God we had an opportunity to bridge that gap. And that's sometimes some of the blessings we have. But if you look at the point I'm making here about the story of, and don't forget, CPR is very important this time of the year to revive our souls. I'm just, I've mentioned it to you before, that just as, God forbid, when a person goes into cardiac arrest, they need CPR, right? And what do we do when we're performing CPR? We do compressions on the heart, right? We have to put our hands together and push on the person's heart. What's the numerical value? What's the Hebrew word for heart? Lev. What's the numerical value? 32. What's the equation of compressions that you're supposed to give? 30 compressions to 2 breaths, like the word Lev. Hey? So that's CPR. And what's the CPR in the spiritual sense? Charity, prayer, repentance. And that brings blessings to us for our families in all the areas that we need, for our children, for our parnasa, for our sustenance, for our livelihood, and for our, what should we give the R? Give another name. For? A relaxation. Very good. So, at that stage, I told you previously about the Jewish community that was living in Poland. In fact, the authors of the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch was also authored by a rabbi during that time. I mean, that was an era, again, of tremendous revival in Jewish teachings. If you take the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, it was written during the same time during that era, the 16th century. Who was it? Who wrote it? Anyone remember? Rabbi Yosef Cairo. Okay, was he from Spain or Cairo? I don't know. His name's Cairo. Maybe he came from Egypt. But he certainly was a Sephardic Jew. At the same time, in Poland, in Krakow, lived Rabbi Moshe Isserles, who wrote a similar code of Jewish law. And instead of having 2 different books of Jewish law, they combined the 2. I think we have a lot to learn from those 2 fellows in the way we do things today, right? So they combined the 2 works, and there we get the code of Jewish law. Inside it is the universal laws as was followed by Sephardic Jewry, and there were notes on how Ashkenaz customs differed. But, pardon? Shulchan Aruch, correct. But with all that prosperity and affluence and all the wonderful things that were happening in Eastern Europe at the time, all the good did not last too long. What's the expression about that? There's some expression, the good is not destined to last. In Spain, there was the golden era of Spanish Jewry. There was a time that Judaism flourished there and Judaism prospered. Then came the Spanish Inquisition. And prior to the Holocaust, the worst event that happened to the Jews actually probably was what happened in the years Tach V'Tat. What's Tach V'Tat? Tach is Tav Chet, 1648. Tat is Tav Tet, 1649. In those 2 years, I believe about 300,000 Jews were murdered in Eastern Europe. In Poland, Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, those countries. And I'll put on a video in a moment that will describe to you what was called the Khmelnytsky Uprising, Cossacks, and a terrible, terrible time where they literally murdered Jews throughout Poland, Lithuania, that whole Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There was an envy of the nobility there. And they unleashed their wrath, of course, on the Jewish people, and they murdered countless Jews. If I stand corrected, I think about 300,000 Jews were murdered during that time. Jewish communities were plundered, were pillaged. Thousands were barbarically butchered to death, and many more found themselves impoverished, penniless, homeless. And that was the era of a very, you can imagine the monumental tragedy of that, the depressing feeling of Jewish people, how despair overcame them, the hopelessness that people had at that time. And it wasn't just about the terrible loss of life and property and all the other aspects that made it so devastating. It was actually the tragic spiritual toll as well. You see, with their sources of income gone, the Jews in those countries were no longer affluent, and many Jewish youth had to abandon their commitment to Torah studies, and instead they were forced to go to work to help their families make ends meet. These were the survivors. 300,000 were murdered. So it's the survivors who had to go out there. So with the collapse of all the Jewish institutions due to these events that happened, that financial support was gone. Imagine, God forbid, Chaver Kadisha not existing. What would happen to all the people here in our community who need their support, right? Many yeshivas were forced to close their doors. And gradually, Torah study became not what we would today consider a given. It became a luxury. It was only affordable by those who, far and few in between who could afford it. And even though people did remain faithful and observant, but the masses grew distant from their heritage of rich Torah academia, which led to another problem, which was a rift in Jewish society during that time. When the elite, let's call them the elite class of Torah scholars, they found themselves decreasing in numbers. Many of them adopted this ascetic lifestyle, you know what I mean, where they lived as hermits, separate from everyone else. They were like the separatist lifestyle. They wanted to avoid any external influences that might weaken their spirituality. Call it the ghetto, the shtetl. There was this behavior that meant that they didn't intermingle with the rest of Jewish people. They stayed apart. They would study, they would fast, they would pray, they would do all types of things to shut themselves out from the world around them and from the plight of their ignorant, maybe even some of them looked at them as inferior fellow Jews. And with time, these elite scholars began to view the commoners, sadly, with disdain. They really saw them as less. They were just horrified. I don't know if it was an elitism, a supremacy complex, or just, how could you consider yourself Jewish even? You don't even know what an aleph is. You don't know what a beis. You don't know the laws. Not that doesn't exist today in some circles, unfortunately. What do you know? You ever hear that from people? Unfortunately, sometimes people could get a little bit heich in the fence to them. And I hear that complaint even today, and we shouldn't repeat the same mistakes of the past, where people feel. Last night I was in one of the retirement facilities talking to some of the residents, and this woman was telling me, she's very happy her children became religious and they're observant, but she doesn't like is, she says, and I said, I don't think my kids do this. I don't know what school her grandkids go to, but she said that they feel they're better. They look down at those who aren't as observant as them, and I feel that's really bad. Certainly not the Chabad way, I'll tell you that much. Because the Chabad way is to follow the teachings of the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov did not like what he saw at all. He did not like that there was this them and us kind of competition going on. Pardon? Yeah, no, the class distinctions, exactly. And this is where the Baal Shem Tov comes into the picture, because he was born, like I said, tonight in 1698. And when he was 36 years old in 1734 is when he started his movement called Hasidism. He wanted to wake up the Jewish community. and he was by profession a balagola. You know what a balagola is? A bus driver. Okay, a wagon driver, fine. We had a driver when we were kids. We would go to, still, if you go to New York today, the bus drivers to the schools are Jewish people, religious Jews. So I remember somebody once teasing our bus driver. It was a Russian Jew. He said, bista balagola. You know what that means? You know, you're a wagon driver. So the driver gave a quick retort. He said, yeah, Amal, once upon a time, is given, the balagola sat behind, on the third, the forces were in the front. He said, vice dois, today it's the opposite, you know? So it's in this context that the Baal Shem Tov appears on the scene, and on this day that he was born, and even his birth is quite an interesting story because he was born to his parents in their old age. Call it the late Lamaki. Is that what you call it here in South Africa? Yeah. Laat Lamaki. Okay. Ik ken niet praat Afrikaans nie. Verstaan? Oh, Vicky. There you go. So this is where the Baal Shem Tov appears on the scene. His parents were Rabbi Eliezer. His mother, that was his father, and his mother was Rivka. And they passed away tragically when he was just a young boy. He lost both of his parents. But that is an important detail, because just as he was born to his parents in their old age, he used that as a motto, as a theme, saying that we have to see each of ourselves as if we are an only child born to our Father in heaven, to God Almighty, in their old age, so to say. He used that as a theme, just like you can imagine that his parents were so delighted to be blessed with a child in their old age that they spoiled him rotten. But luckily, he wasn't a spoiled brat. He used that metaphor of the way they spoiled him because of his birth in their old age as a metaphor that each of us is, so to say, like an only child to God. In fact, there's a famous expression in the Talmud. It was yesterday's Hayom Yom. And this is the theme of Hatzalah. What's Hatzalah's motto? You save one life, you save a whole world. And the Baal Shem Tov certainly used that theme and said, you know, when you think about the idea, you're not just saving one individual. One person is a whole universe. Just think about the future generations that could come from them. Like in yesterday's story of King George, who saved this young boy, Beryl Gartner. Beryl Gartner, he and those 1,000 children who were rescued on the Kinder transport, all of them were rescued. And Beryl was lucky that also his parents, because he asked of King George, his wish was granted. And in that sense, of course, we need to ask God too, and our wishes will be granted. But just imagine, his whole family was rescued and saved. You have one extra family, or one less family that weren't victims of the Holocaust because of that boy's courage and the kindness of King George. So what I'm going to do right now is put on this video, and let's learn a little bit about the history of the Baal Shem Tov. And after that video, we'll conclude for lunch. Please God, tomorrow we will continue, because I didn't even get into the teachings, which I really wanted to do today. But, we allowed it to be a little bit conversationalist, and I wanted to give you a little bit of the background, and that's the way we do it. So please God, tomorrow we'll get into some of his teachings. I want to give you tomorrow 3 teachings of the Baal Shem Tov that I think you will find inspiring, and will give you an idea of what mysticism, Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah is about, and what Hasidus is on top of Kabbalah. What did it do different than Kabbalah? But that will be for tomorrow. Let's put on the video, and with that, we'll conclude today.
In the 14th century, Jews migrated en masse to Poland, which then controlled parts of the Ukraine and Lithuania.
First major Polish king, Kazimierz the Great, invites Jews to come to live in Poland to help to develop the country economically. He gives them very, very good conditions of life. He gives them tax breaks. He gives them all kinds of rights, which perhaps normally the Catholic Church would not want them to have. And that attracts a lot of Jews eastward. What also attracts the Jews eastward is the fact that Jews are thrown out of England in 1290, they're thrown out of France in 1306 for the first time, and out of France for the last time in 1394. There are all kinds of anti-Jewish attacks and blood libels and all kinds of other libels and massacres throughout Germany in the 14th century, so that the survivors run eastward, where anti-Semitism perhaps is not as deeply embedded yet in the population.
For 3 centuries, Poland's Jews enjoyed a respite from the relentless persecution that racked neighboring lands. They referred optimistically to their host country by the Hebrew po-lin, meaning "we shall rest here," hoping that the tranquility would continue until the Messiah would arrive to lead them back to their homeland. Safety and financial stability translated into a spiritual blossoming. Poland became the epicenter of Ashkenazic Jewry, with an exceptional pious norm. In one of his works, 17th century mystic Rabbi Nosson Hanover describes the climax of their spiritual climb.
Every Jewish community maintained a yeshiva. Every community had young students whom they supported with a weekly stipend so they could study. There was scarcely a house in all of Poland where the Torah was not studied.
In the 16th century, the Szlachta, the Polish nobility, puts the Jews to work many Jews to work in a very special enterprise. They conquer the Ukraine and take over all kinds of very large estates, and Jews are appointed to run the estates for the Szlachta. Now, the Ukraine, as opposed to the rest of Poland, is not Catholic. The Ukraine is Greek Orthodox. The Ukrainians see the Poles as not only as overlords and as oppressors who squeeze them for money, they also see them as heretics.
In 1648, a savage man by the name of Bogdan Chmelnytsky led the Ukrainian Cossacks in an uprising against the ruling Polish nobility in a bid for independence. Chmelnytsky diverted much of his war effort to a genocidal purge of the region's Jews. As agents of the Polish nobility, the Jews collected the taxes that the non-Jewish residents owed to the Polish landlords. This had provided many Jews with financial security, but it now resulted in great suffering.
The Jewish community suffers tremendous damage. The leadership is wiped out, communities are laid low, Jews are murdered wholesale, and the Jewish community is dealt a blow from which it never will recover.
The survivors suffered exceptional trauma. Families struggled to earn a livelihood, and only a minority could afford their children a Torah education. Soon, a social rift emerged between the few scholars and the overwhelming majority of largely ignorant, impoverished Jews. This fissure only served to deepen the national trauma. Into this gloom, there stepped a man bearing tidings of salvation. It happened in 1665.
There appeared in the city of Smyrna in Turkey, in the Ottoman Empire at the time, a man named Shabtai Tzvi, a greatly charismatic, learned individual who declared himself to be the Messiah. He started a movement which spread like wildfire. There's a famous Jewish woman whose name was Glickel of Hameln, which is in Germany. She describes how her father packed his bags, sold his business, sat there waiting with his packed bags, waiting for the Messiah to reveal himself. The word came to Poland, and none other than Rabbi David Halevi, who was known in rabbinic circles as the author of one of the major commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, sent his son and someone else to go check out Shabtai Tzvi to see if it's possible that this is really the real thing. There were people who objected. There were people who warned, especially there was a rabbi in Amsterdam whose name was Rabbi Sasportas, who screamed and yelled that this guy's a fraud, but nobody wanted to listen to him.
Reasons for concern rapidly mounted as Shabtai grew increasingly erratic. His devotees attributed this to a superior state, but others recognized that he was mentally unstable. Modern scholars believe that he suffered from bipolar disorder. He introduced blatant violations of Torah law. Since the Messiah has arrived, he explained, matters previously forbidden are now permitted. One man who was particularly unimpressed with Shabtai was the Ottoman ruler Sultan Mehmed IV, who jailed the pseudo-Messiah as a revolutionary in February 1666. 7 months later, the Sultan gave him a choice of Islam or death. Shabtai chose Islam, and Jews worldwide reeled in disbelief.
The intensity of the anticipation that this was the Mashiach was so high that as high as the heights were of anticipation, so were the depths of disappointment among many, many Jews within the world. And the blow was just incalculable.
The Jews of Poland felt doubly abandoned. The new despair dashed their hopes for healing into the blood-soaked reality of post-massacre Poland, compounding hopelessness with suffering and social imbalance with spiritual crisis. A leadership vacuum ensued, and unworthy rabbis took advantage of the chaos and purchased or rented the title rabbi from the local nobles. These rabbis downplayed prayer and sincere spiritual growth. They focused on exhibiting their keen, analytic abilities, hoping to become widely known. Pay-to-play rabbis were not the role models and guides the struggling communities required at this fragile time. And by ripping the heart out of the daily prayers, these rabbis tore the soul out of a meaningful dialogue with God, just when the people needed it most. Despite a number of positive developments in Poland, even after 1648, Polish Jewry was in an overall material and spiritual decline. Many God-fearing Torah scholars struggled to survive. Unable and unwilling to bribe their way into rabbinical posts, they could also not rely on their impoverished brethren to hire them as teachers. Rather than fraternize with the unlearned masses, many such scholars embraced asceticism, studying, fasting, and praying in seclusion from their communities. Such individuals, who would normally have served as genuine role models, became unavailable to the community. Moreover, their overly ascetic lifestyles made them melancholic, deepening the national gloom. By the beginning of the 18th century, Jewry was spiritually lethargic, perhaps even comatose. This was the dismal scene into which Rabbi Yisrael Baal Shem Tov entered and began to spread his teachings.
Okay, ladies and gents, we'll continue tomorrow. Please enjoy lunch. And don't forget this evening to join us at the Capitol Hotel in Santon for a great event of inspiration starting 7:30 p.m. And you're all welcome and everyone's invited.